Hey everyone, tonight we're doing something different. You've probably never been truly hungry. Like, check your phone for food delivery apps hungry, sure. But what if I told you there was a time when an entire continent ran out of food for 7 years straight? When rain fell so hard and so long that crops rotted in the fields, when people ate grass, bark and things I won't mention before bedtime. So grab a snack if you want, you'll appreciate it more after tonight. Drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I love knowing who else is awake during these quiet hours. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's walk together into the longest, hungriest nightmare Europe ever survived. You wake up in the spring of 1315, and the first thing you hear is rain. Not the gentle morning drizzle that kisses your garden awake, but a relentless, angry drumming on your thatched roof that sounds like God himself is having a tantrum. The kind of rain that makes you wonder if someone upstairs forgot to turn off the cosmic faucet. You've been hearing this sound for weeks now, and it's starting to feel less like weather and more like a threat. Your straw mattress is damp. Everything is damp. The air tastes like mold and regret. And when you breathe in deeply, you can smell the sour tang of rotting vegetation drifting through your window. It's the smell of hope decomposing. You pull your wool blanket closer, but it's scratchy and damp, like hugging a wet sheep that's given up on life. Outside, what used to be your barley field looks like a shallow lake punctuated by drowning storks that wave feebly in the current like they're surrendering to forces beyond their control. The soil beneath is so waterlogged it's turned into a muddy soup that sucks at your boots when you walk. It reminds you of oatmeal, except oatmeal doesn't usually destroy your entire year's food supply. You step outside and the rain hits your face immediately, fat, cold drops that feel like tiny liquid accusations. Your neighbour Edgar is standing knee-deep in what used to be his wheat field, staring at the brown, slimy stalks with the hollow expression of someone watching their future disappear in real time. He doesn't wave. You don't either. What's the point? You're both thinking the same thing. This is the year we starve. Listen to the steady drip of water falling from the eaves of your cottage, each drop a tiny countdown timer. The sound is almost hypnotic, like nature's own version of a sleep playlist, except the lyrics are about famine and death. But here's what you don't know yet. This isn't just bad weather. This is the beginning of what historians will call the Great Famine. 7 years of crop failure, starvation, and social collapse that will kill more than 10% of Northern Europe's population. You're about to live through what some scholars consider the worst subsistence crisis in recorded European history. Congratulations, you've won the medieval equivalent of a really, really terrible lottery. The church bell rings for morning prayers, but it sounds different today. Hollow, like the bronze itself has caught the despair that's settling over the village like fog. Father Benedict will probably talk about God's mysterious ways again, but standing here watching your livelihood dissolve into muddy water, mysterious ways feel a lot like divine abandonment. Your boots make squelching sounds as you trudge back toward your cottage. Each step pulls at the soggy ground like it's trying to drag you down into the earth with all the rotting crops. The mud clings to your feet with the persistence of bad luck, heavy and stubborn, and impossible to shake off completely. Inside, your wife Margaret is stirring a pot of what passes for breakfast these days. Thin barley gruel stretched with too much water and flavoured with anxiety. She doesn't look up when you enter, just keeps stirring with mechanical precision, as if the right stirring technique might transform inadequate ingredients into actual nourishment. The rain keeps falling, and with each drop the price of grain inches higher in distant markets. But you don't know about markets right now. Right now you're just wondering if you'll have anything to harvest come autumn, and whether that gnawing feeling in your stomach is hunger or fear. Spoiler alert, it's both, and it's about to get much, much worse. 3 months later, you're standing in the village market and the baker is weighing bread like it's made of gold dust. Actually, gold dust might be cheaper at this point. A loaf that used to cost a penny now costs 8, and the baker's hands shake slightly as he counts your coins. Not from nerves, from hunger. Even the people who sell food can't afford to eat it anymore. You watch a woman ahead of you in line carefully count out copper pieces, her fingers moving with the precision of someone performing surgery. She's buying half a loaf for her family of 5. Half. A loaf. You do the math in your head and realise that's roughly 2 bites per person. Maybe 3 if they're feeling optimistic about tomorrow. The bread itself has evolved into something your grandmother wouldn't recognise. What used to be made from good wheat flour is now a greyish mixture of whatever the miller could scrape together. Barley, oats, rye, and rumours suggest some less appetizing ingredients. It tastes like disappointment mixed with sawdust, but it's calories, and calories have become more precious than silver. Listen to the careful clink of coins being counted, each one representing a difficult choice between eating today or saving for tomorrow. The sound echoes through the market like a sad song about priorities nobody wanted to learn. Behind you, a merchant from the next town over whispers to his companion about prices in London. Wheat is selling for 40 shillings a quarter, he says, when it used to be 6. That's not inflation. That's economic apocalypse with a side of social collapse. People are starting to do things that would have been unthinkable a year ago. You overhear two mothers negotiating the trade of a cooking pot for a handful of turnips. Not because they want turnips, but because turnips are food, and food has become the only currency that matters. Money can't fill an empty stomach, but turnips can, even if they taste like crunchy sadness dipped in desperation. The baker weighs your purchased loaf with exaggerated care, as if those extra few grains might make the difference between survival and starvation, which honestly they might. Every crumb has value now. Every morsel gets calculated against future hunger. Waste has become a sin that doesn't require confession, because everyone already knows it's wrong. But here's where it gets really medieval. The wealthy are starting to hoard grain. Not just buying extra for winter storage, but purchasing entire harvests and locking them away in fortified granaries while people starve outside the gates. It's like playing Monopoly, except the board is real life and the properties are the difference between eating and dying. A child tugs at his mother's skirt, asking for a bite of her precious bread, and she breaks off a piece so small it would have been insulting during normal times. Now it represents careful calculation, maternal love measured in crumbs. The child chews slowly, making the tiny portion last as long as possible, already learning the mathematics of scarcity. You buy your bread, expensive, grey, depressing bread, and tuck it carefully into your cloak like you're smuggling state secrets. Because in a way you are. Having food has become a secret worth keeping, and showing it off publicly is an invitation for desperate people to make desperate choices. Walking home, you pass a group of children playing in the mud. Their game involves pretending to be merchants selling invisible food to invisible customers. Even their play has been infected by the hunger that's creeping through every corner of daily life like an unwelcome houseguest who's decided to stay forever. By autumn, you've learnt that bark can be edible if you prepare it right. Not good, mind you. It tastes like chewing on disappointment flavoured with tree, but it fills the hollow ache in your stomach for a few hours. You strip it from birch trees mostly, because birch bark has a slightly sweet taste that doesn't immediately make you question your life choices. Your cooking pot, once reserved for proper stews and hearty soups, now bubbles with combinations that would have made you gag a year ago. Grass soup is a real thing now. Nettle broth that stings your tongue and burns your throat but provides something resembling nutrition. Acorn mash that requires days of preparation to leach out the bitter tannins, leaving you with something that resembles food if you squint really hard and pretend you're eating something else. You sit with your neighbours around a fire, sharing recipes for things that aren't technically food. Someone mentions grinding up dried fish bones to stretch flour. Another person describes a porridge made from crushed peas, sawdust and hope. The conversation has the surreal quality of a cooking show from hell, except nobody's laughing and everyone's taking notes. Listen to the gentle bubbling of your strange soup, full of ingredients you never thought you'd eat, simmering over a fire that represents warmth, community, and the stubborn human refusal to give up even when everything seems hopeless. Margaret has become an artist of scarcity, transforming inedible ingredients into something that won't kill you. She boils leather scraps until they're soft enough to chew, seasons grass with whatever herbs she can forage, and stretches a handful of grain into soup that somehow feeds 4 people. Watching her work is like witnessing magic, except magic that tastes terrible and barely keeps you alive. But people are starting to disappear. Not dramatically, this isn't a war where bodies pile up in the streets. It's quieter than that. The old woman who used to sell herbs at the market just isn't there anymore. The family down the lane with too many children has fewer children now, and nobody talks about it because what would be the point? You've heard whispers about worse things, stories that drift in from other villages, about people eating things that used to have names, about desperate choices made in desperate times. You don't repeat these stories and you try not to think about them too hard, but they settle into your mind like unwelcome seeds that might sprout into nightmares. The miller's wife has started adding sawdust to flour, not to cheat customers but to stretch what little grain remains. Everyone knows, everyone accepts it, because sawdust bread is better than no bread. The texture is awful, like chewing on wood chips mixed with guilt, but it fills space in your stomach that would otherwise echo with emptiness. Children have learned to eat things their parents never would have allowed them to touch. They chew on leather screes, suck on stones for the salt taste, and fight over apple cores like they're precious jewels. Childhood innocence has been replaced by survival instincts that seem both heartbreaking and impressive. The thing about starvation is that it doesn't just make you hungry, it makes you tired in a bone-deep way that sleep can't fix. Your thoughts move slower, colours seem less bright, even your dreams have become smaller, focused on simple things like warm bread, fresh milk, the luxury of feeling full instead of just not quite empty. You measure time differently now, not by seasons or church bells, but by meals. How long since you ate something that actually satisfied you? How many days until you'll have to make another choice between heating your home and buying food? The mathematics of survival have become unexpectedly complex, requiring calculations you never learned in school. But here's what keeps you going. Community. When everyone is struggling, sharing becomes sacred. A neighbour brings you turnip greens that would have been pig food before the famine. You share your birch bark preparation technique with anyone who asks. Someone else contributes firewood gathered from fallen branches. Hunger might be individual, but survival, you're learning, is collective. Tonight, you'll sleep on a stomach that isn't full but isn't completely empty either. And tomorrow you'll wake up to the sound of rain again, because the rain never really stopped. It just became the soundtrack to a life you never imagined you'd have to live, but somehow you're living it anyway. You're walking past the manor house when you see something that would have been unthinkable just 2 years ago. Lord Robert's steward, haggling over the price of turnips with the same desperation you've seen on peasant faces. The man who used to oversee vast wheat stores and fine wine cellars is now negotiating for root vegetables like his life depends on it. Which honestly it probably does. The famine doesn't care about your social status, turns out. Hunger is democracy's evil twin. It comes for everyone eventually, just in slightly different orders. The wealthy had bigger food stores to start with, sure, but even the deepest granary eventually runs empty when the harvest fails for 3 consecutive years. Privilege becomes meaningless when there's nothing left to be privileged about. You watch through the manor's kitchen window as servants prepare what used to be considered animal feed. Oat bran mixed with whatever vegetables haven't rotted, seasoned with desperation and served with a side of disbelief. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife, if you could afford meat to go with it. Listen to the careful scraping of spoons against bowls, as even the wealthy stretch every bite, every morsel, precious now regardless of who's eating it. The sound of equality imposed by starvation rather than achieved through justice. But here's where medieval social structure gets really interesting. When everyone's hungry, the traditional power dynamics start to wobble like a drunk monk on Sunday morning. The lord who used to command respect through land ownership now finds himself competing with his own peasants for the same limited resources. Suddenly, the peasant who knows how to make acorn flour becomes more valuable than the noble who only knows how to give orders. You've noticed that Lord Robert doesn't speak with quite the same authority anymore. His voice has developed a careful, almost pleading quality when he addresses the village about tax collections. 'Cause what's the point of demanding grain taxes when there's no grain? You can't squeeze blood from a turnip, and you can't collect wheat from fields that are underwater. The manor's hunting has transformed from sport into survival. Instead of magnificent boars and ceremonial venison, they're tracking rabbits, squirrels, anything with calories. The great hall that once hosted elaborate feasts now echoes with the sound of careful rationing, portions measured not by appetite but by available supply. Even the dogs are skinnier, their ribs showing through patchy fur as they compete with humans for scraps. The hunting hounds that used to be pampered symbols of wealth now scavenge like common strays. Animals, it turns out, don't understand social hierarchy any better than starvation does. Fringe historical fact. Some nobles during this period actually sold their land, their titles, even their ancestral homes to buy food. Imagine being so hungry you trade your family's centuries-old legacy for a bag of barley. That's not desperation. That's medieval rock bottom, with a side of existential crisis and a garnish of social revolution. You've become unexpectedly good at math, the kind they don't teach in monastery schools. How many calories in a turnip? How long can you stretch a handful of peas? If you eat half portions for 10 days, will you have enough energy to work the remaining functional corner of your field? These are the equations that determine whether you see spring, and failure means more than a bad grade. Every transaction now involves complex calculations that would make a merchant's head spin. Trade 2 chickens for a sack of grain, but save 1 chicken for eggs, except chickens need grain too. So really you're trading future food for present food while hoping the future takes care of itself. It's like playing chess, except every piece is edible, and losing means starvation. Your cottage has transformed into an accounting office where everything gets measured, weighed and calculated down to the last crumb. You count beans, literally. 23 beans for today, 19 for tomorrow, save 30 for the end of the week. You've developed the mental math skills of a tax collector, except instead of stealing money, you're stealing time from hunger. Listen to the soft rustle of grain being sorted, counted, portioned into tiny piles that represent days, weeks, maybe months of survival if you're careful and lucky, and that's rain stops and the next harvest doesn't fail. Margaret has created an elaborate system of food storage that would impress a monastery quartermaster. Dried vegetables sorted by size and estimated nutrition value. Grain portioned into daily allowances marked with notches on wooden sticks. Even water gets measured now because clean water has become another scarce resource when wells overflow with contaminated runoff. But the economics extend beyond individual households. Entire villages are forming cooperatives, pooling resources in ways that would have seemed revolutionary if anyone had time to think about politics. Mrs. Margaret contributes root vegetables, Thomas provides firewood, you share your birch bark. Preparation skills. It's not charity, it's mutual assured survival. Money has become almost abstract. What good is a silver coin if there's nothing to buy? Barter is king now, and the exchange rates are written in desperation. A cooking pot for 3 days' worth of food, a wool blanket for a bag of sprouted grain. Your grandmother's prayer book for enough turnips to last a week. The church has started accepting payment in kind rather than coin. Instead of tithing money, people bring whatever they can spare. A handful of nuts, dried fish, sometimes just labour. Even God apparently is flexible when the alternative is watching his flock starve to death in front of his altar. You've heard stories from travelling merchants about cities where people are selling their clothes, their tools, their furniture to buy food. Entire households stripped bare except for cooking pots and whatever's absolutely necessary for survival. It's like watching civilization slowly undress itself, removing everything decorative or comfortable until only the essential remains. Children have learned to count differently too. Instead of numbers, they count bytes. Instead of toys, they count scraps. A 6-year-old can calculate how to divide 2 turnips among 5 people better than most adults could manage complex fractions during normal times. Necessity has turned toddlers into mathematicians of misery. By the 3rd year of famine, you've witnessed the complete breakdown of traditional pricing. A single egg costs more than a day's wages used to be worth. A cup of milk has become a luxury item that people save up for like it's jewellery. You've seen grown men weep over spilled porridge because those calories can't be replaced, and tears don't provide nutrition. The market has transformed from a place of abundance to a grim auction house where desperation determines value. Sellers name prices that sound like jokes until you realise they're completely serious. A handful of barley for a silver piece. A small loaf of bread for half a week's wages. The numbers are so disconnected from reality that they've entered the realm of dark fantasy. You watch a merchant try to sell grain at prices so high that even other merchants are shaking their heads in disgust. But there's a line of customers anyway, because when the choice is between expensive food and no food, expensive food wins every time. The invisible hand of the market has become a fist, and it's punching everyone in the stomach. Listen to the hushed negotiations as people bargain for food like they are buying forbidden treasures. Voices low and urgent, aware that desperation makes everyone dangerous and desperate people make desperate choices. But here's the twisted genius of famine economics. It creates its own opportunities. Smart merchants who hoarded grain early are now richer than nobles. Peasants who learned to preserve unusual foods have become informal consultants commanding respect and payment. The woman who knows how to make decent bread from acorn flour has more social capital than the priest who can only offer prayers. Some people have started specialising in famine foods, becoming entrepreneurs of desperation. There's a man 2 villages over who's become famous for his birch bark preparation methods. He actually charges consultation fees now. Another who's perfected a technique for making fishbone flour that doesn't taste completely awful. They're not just surviving, they're thriving, relatively speaking. The truly wealthy, the ones who prepared early, who saw the writing on the wall and stockpiled accordingly, have become almost mythical figures. People whisper about the merchant family who allegedly has a secret granary filled with wheat, or the monastery that supposedly has enough stored food to last a decade. These might be rumours, but in desperate times, rumours become their own form of currency. You've learned to recognise the signs of secret wealth, clothes that aren't quite as patched as everyone else's, skin that isn't quite as pale, movements that don't carry the careful, energy-conserving rhythm of the chronically hungry. The hoarders walk differently, talk differently, exist differently, in a world where most people are slowly consuming themselves. Coin has become almost decorative. People still accept silver and copper, but they prefer trade goods, food, tools, clothing, anything with immediate practical value. A beautiful silver chalice might buy a day's worth of grain, while a simple cooking pot could command a week's supply. Utility has trumped beauty in the marketplace of survival. The tax collectors still arrive with their official documents and royal demands, but they're met with empty granaries and genuinely empty purses. You can't collect taxes from people who own nothing but their lives, and even those are negotiable when starvation sets the terms. Royal authority means nothing when the crown can't provide bread. Tonight, you count your remaining stores by candlelight, each item representing a small victory against the mathematics of starvation. Tomorrow, those equations will shift again. Prices will change, desperate people will make desperate choices. But for now, you have enough. Just enough. And in the 3rd year of the Great Famine, just enough feels like winning the lottery with odds calculated in human misery. You notice it first in the way people's eyes move now, darting, calculating, measuring. Where once your neighbour Thomas would greet you with a hearty wave and maybe an invitation to share ale, now his gaze automatically drops to whatever bundle you're carrying, trying to guess whether it contains food. The social warmth that used to bind your village together has been replaced by a cooler, more predatory attention that makes every interaction feel like a negotiation. Trust is becoming a luxury nobody can afford. You find yourself checking and rechecking the locks on your grain stores, and you're not paranoid, just realistic. Last week someone broke into the miller's house and stole a bag of mouldy barley that wouldn't have been fit for pigs 2 years ago. The thief left everything else untouched. Silver cups, wool blankets, even a small chest of coins. They only wanted food, and they were willing to risk everything for it. The gossip has changed too. Instead of who's courting whom or whose roof needs repair, conversations centre on who has how much food, who's been seen buying what at the market, whose children are looking too thin or suspiciously well fed. Information about food stores has become intelligence, traded and hoarded, like the grain itself. Listen to the careful silence that falls when you approach a group of neighbours talking. Their conversations now include secrets, and your presence might represent competition, desperation, or worse, judgment about their own survival choices that they're not ready to defend. Children who used to play together now eye each other's food with the intensity of merchants evaluating trade goods. You've watched kids negotiate over apple cores with the seriousness of diplomats arranging treaties. Sharing that fundamental childhood virtue has become complicated by the mathematics of survival where generosity might mean starvation. Marriage negotiations have turned grimmer too. Instead of discussing dowries in terms of land or livestock, families now calculate food stores, preservation skills and mouth-to-feed ratios. Love hasn't died exactly, but it's learned to count calories and measure affection in terms of resource efficiency. Romance has become practical in ways that would have been unthinkable during abundant times. The village hierarchy has gotten strange. The blacksmith, once respected for his strength and skill, has lost status because iron tools don't fill empty stomachs. Meanwhile, old Mary, who used to be dismissed as the crazy herb woman, has become the most consulted person in the village because she knows which weeds are edible and which ones will kill you faster than starvation. But the most unsettling change is how quickly people have adapted to the new normal. Conversations about extreme rationing, about eating things that used to be considered animal feed, about the relative nutritional value of tree bark, these topics now flow as naturally as weather talk used to. Humanity's capacity to normalize horror is both impressive and deeply disturbing, like watching people learn to breathe underwater. Families have developed internal hierarchies based on survival value, rather than traditional affection. The family member who can work the hardest gets the most food. Children who show signs of weakness might receive smaller portions. Elderly relatives who contribute less labour face subtle pressure to eat less. Love hasn't disappeared, but it's been reorganised according to the brutal logic of triage. Sunday morning and the church feels different, not just because the congregation is thinner, though it definitely is, but because the social contracts that used to bind everyone together are visibly fraying like old rope under too much weight. Father Benedict's sermon about Christian charity rings hollow when everyone knows that sharing food might mean the difference between your family living or dying. You watch the collection basket pass with a fraction of its usual contents. People still drop in coins, but smaller ones, and fewer. Some put in dried beans or small pieces of bread instead of money. The church has quietly started accepting food offerings because even God's house needs to eat. And prayers don't provide calories. The traditional feast days have become exercises in careful pretending. Last Saint's Day, the communal celebration featured thin soup stretched to serve twice as many people, and everyone politely ignored how watery it was. The ritual of abundance had to continue even when abundance was just a memory seasoned with hope and desperation. Listen to the hollow echo of prayers in a half-empty church, where even the sacred words sound smaller, more desperate, as if the congregation is bargaining with God rather than worshipping, negotiating for divine intervention in exchange for continued faith. But here's where medieval Christianity gets tested. The obligation to care for the poor becomes complicated when everyone is poor. The monastery, which used to provide food for beggars and travellers, now has to choose between feeding their own monks and maintaining their charitable duties. Charity becomes triage, and triage requires choices that nobody wants to make, but somebody has to. You've heard rumours that some parish priests are breaking their vows of poverty in reverse, not by accumulating wealth, but by sharing the church's stores with their starving congregations. These priests risk punishment from their superiors, but they've apparently decided that letting people starve while sitting on grain stores is the greater sin. The traditional medieval concept of noblesse oblige, that the wealthy have obligations to care for their dependents, has crashed against the reality of universal scarcity. When the Lord's own family is eating turnip soup, the feudal obligation to provide for peasants becomes more theoretical than practical, more historical footnote than daily reality. Marriage ceremonies have been postponed or simplified because the traditional feast afterwards would consume resources that families can't spare. Weddings now feature token celebrations, a shared cup of weak ale, a small loaf of dark bread broken among many people. Love persists, but it's learned to be more economical with its celebrations. Even funeral customs have adapted to scarcity. The traditional practice of providing food for mourners after a burial has largely disappeared. Death, which used to bring communities together in shared feasting and remembrance, now just removes one more mouth to feed. The rituals of grief have been streamlined by necessity, made more efficient and less comforting. Baptisms continue, but the celebration afterwards has shrunk to symbolic portions. A new life entering the world still deserves recognition, but the community can no longer afford elaborate welcomes. Hope for the future has to be expressed in smaller gestures, more modest rituals that acknowledge both joy and the reality of limited resources. Crime has taken on new dimensions that the old laws never anticipated. Stealing food isn't just theft anymore. It's a question of life and death that makes moral calculations far more complex than traditional justice ever prepared for. You hear about cases being brought before the village court where the accused freely admits to the crime, but pleads survival as justification, and nobody quite knows how to respond. The punishment for stealing bread used to be straightforward: public humiliation, fines, maybe a day in the stocks. But what do you do when the thief is a mother who stole barley to keep her children from starving, and the victim is a neighbour whose own family is barely surviving? Traditional justice assumes abundance that no longer exists, and social contracts that have been broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control. You've witnessed entirely new categories of social conflict. Disputes over gleaning rights in harvested fields have become vicious because those overlooked grains might represent days of survival. Arguments over foraging territories have led to actual violence. grown men fighting with farming tools over the right to strip bark from specific trees. Listen to the tense negotiations when someone is accused of taking more than their fair share from communal stores. These aren't court proceedings, they're community interventions trying to balance survival needs against social cohesion, attempting to maintain civilization while everyone slowly starves. Hoarding has become a crime without formal laws. When someone is discovered to have significantly more food than they've admitted, the social pressure can be overwhelming. Not theft exactly, but a kind of community-enforced redistribution that operates outside normal legal frameworks. People who prepared too well for the famine find themselves having to hide their foresight like it's a shameful secret. The concept of fair pricing has disintegrated. Merchants charging extremely high prices for basic necessities aren't technically breaking any laws, but they're violating social contracts that used to govern community life. Some villages have formed informal committees to negotiate price controls, creating ad hoc economic regulation born from desperation and enforced through social pressure. Begging has lost its traditional stigma because everyone understands that circumstances could easily reverse. The beggar today might be the donor tomorrow, depending on whose food stores run out first. This has created a strange social fluidity where traditional class boundaries matter less than current access to calories and the luck of the harvest. You've heard stories about villages that have implemented communal rationing systems, essentially creating temporary socialism to manage scarce resources. Private property rights get fuzzy when everyone's survival depends on careful resource allocation. Individual ownership competes with collective survival, and survival is winning the argument. But perhaps the strangest crime is the crime of waste. Dropping food, letting grain spoil, feeding scraps to animals that could feed humans, these have become social offences that can result in community ostracism. Every calorie has become precious, and squandering calories has become a form of violence against the community's collective survival. Violence itself has changed character. People don't fight over honour or pride anymore. They fight over turnips, over access to foraging areas, over the right to glean in fields that have already been harvested. Combat has become practical rather than emotional, focused on immediate survival needs rather than abstract principles. You wake up and your body feels like it's at war with itself. Not the gentle grumble of missing breakfast. That's cute hunger, tourist hunger. This is industrial strength starvation, the kind where your stomach has given up complaining and moved on to just aching with a hollow persistence that colours everything you do. It's like having a cavity in your torso that nothing can fill, no matter how much tree bark and grass soup you pour into it. Your skin has started to feel different, papery and cold even when you're sitting by the fire. Touch your arm and it's like touching someone else, pale and strange, and somehow less substantial than it used to be. Your hair, which used to be brown and thick, has taken on a brittle quality that reminds you uncomfortably of dried grass waiting for a spark. Even your fingernails have become soft and bendable, as if your body is slowly consuming itself from the extremities inward, making difficult choices about what parts it can afford to maintain. You press on your nail and it gives way like soft cheese, a small horror that somehow represents all the larger horrors of systematic starvation. The dizziness comes in waves, usually when you stand up too quickly or try to do anything more demanding than sitting quietly and conserving energy. Your head spins like you've been drinking, except instead of ale, you've been drinking emptiness. And emptiness is a much more powerful intoxicant than any fermented grain. Listen to the way your stomach sounds different now, not gurgling with hunger, but making small defeated sounds like a bellows that's running out of air. Like an organ that's forgotten its original purpose and is just going through the motions. Your thoughts move differently too. Everything requires more effort, more time. Simple calculations that used to be automatic now feel like complex problems that require sitting down and thinking carefully. You find yourself staring at familiar objects, a spoon, a wooden bowl, trying to remember what they're for. Not because you don't know, but because the knowledge sits further away, harder to reach. Sleep has become both escape and torment. You dream about food constantly, not fancy food, just normal food. Bread that tastes like bread instead of sawdust and desperation. Milk that doesn't come watered down with necessity. Meat that isn't mysterious scraps traded for precious vegetables. You wake up from these dreams with your mouth watering, and the crushing disappointment of reality settling back into place like a heavy blanket made of hunger. The cold bothers you more now. Not just weather cold, but the cold that comes from the inside out. The kind that no amount of clothing or fire seems to touch. Your body isn't generating heat the way it used to because it doesn't have fuel to burn, so you become a walking iceberg in human form. But here's the insidious part. Hunger becomes normal. After months of chronic undernourishment, the sharp edge of starvation dulls into a constant background sensation. Like tinnitus for your entire body. You stop noticing it consciously, but it shapes everything. How you move, how you think, how you interact with the world around you. Your family has developed a complex protocol around meals that would have seemed absurd during abundant times. Father eats first, not because of patriarchal tradition, but because he needs strength for the physical labour that keeps everyone alive. Mother eats second, but only after ensuring everyone else has something. Children eat according to age and health. The youngest and weakest get priority, while older children who can better survive short-term hunger wait. You've learned to eat slowly, not from politeness, but from necessity. Each bite gets chewed thoroughly, partly to aid digestion with reduced saliva production, but mostly to stretch the psychological satisfaction of eating. A spoonful of thin porridge can be made to last several minutes if you're careful about it, turning consumption into meditation. Sharing food has developed its own elaborate etiquette, more complex than any royal court protocol. When someone offers you a portion of their meal, refusing would be insulting, but accepting might mean they go without. The dance of polite hunger involves careful assessment of who can afford to give and who needs to receive, calculations disguised as casual conversation. Listen to the careful clink of spoons against bowls as people scrape up every last bit, the sound echoing longer in empty stomachs than it does in empty rooms, each scrape representing the desperate pursuit of every possible calorie. The sequence of hunger has taught you which parts of meals matter most. Liquid goes first, broth, milk, anything wet and warm that can create the temporary illusion of fullness. Bread or porridge comes next because grains provide sustained energy that lasts longer than vegetables. Any vegetable or protein gets saved for last, eaten with the reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. You've developed techniques for managing hunger pangs that feel like survival skills from another species. Drinking water helps temporarily by filling space, though it also dilutes what few nutrients you're getting. Lying down reduces the gnawing sensation by changing your body's position relative to gravity. Staying busy distracts from the constant awareness of emptiness, though it also uses energy you can't spare. Trading food has become a form of diplomacy requiring careful consideration of social relationships, family obligations, and future reciprocity. When you trade 2 turnips for a handful of barley, you're not just exchanging vegetables, you're creating obligations, testing relationships, and betting on future scarcity levels that nobody can predict. Children have learned to eat differently too. They've stopped being picky about anything because being picky is a luxury that requires alternatives. Kids who used to refuse vegetables now eat weeds with gratitude. The concept of favourite foods has become quaint. Food is food, and all of it is precious regardless of taste, texture, or previous preferences. Margaret has become a master of portion psychology, making tiny amounts of food appear larger through careful presentation and timing. She serves soup in smaller bowls so they look fuller. She cuts bread into many thin slices rather than few thick ones. She spaces meals carefully so hunger doesn't become overwhelming before the next feeding time. 3 months into the worst of the famine, you notice that wounds don't heal the way they used to. A small cut on your hand that should have closed in days has been seeping for weeks, red and angry and refusing to knit itself back together. Your body has apparently decided that healing is a luxury it can't afford when all available resources need to go toward basic survival functions. Your teeth feel loose in your gums, and your mouth tastes metallic most of the time. Bleeding gums have become so common that nobody mentions it anymore. It's just another symptom of a body cannibalizing itself for nutrients it can't get from food. You've learned to chew carefully, avoiding hard foods not because you're picky, but because you're afraid of losing teeth you can't replace. The exhaustion is different from normal tiredness. It's bone-deep cellular, the kind of fatigue that makes climbing a flight of stairs feel like mountain climbing, and makes simple tasks require careful planning and energy conservation. Your body has shifted into conservation mode, shutting down non-essential functions to preserve whatever energy can be scraped together from inadequate nutrition. Listen to your own breathing, more laboured now even during rest, as if your body is working harder just to maintain basic functions on a reduced fuel. like an engine trying to run on watered-down grain alcohol instead of proper fuel. Women in the village have stopped menstruating, their bodies recognizing that pregnancy would be catastrophic under current conditions. It's a biological mercy, but one that comes with its own psychological weight. The absence of normal bodily function serves as a constant reminder of how far from normal life has become, how even reproduction has become impossible. Your memory has gotten unreliable, especially for recent events. You can remember childhood perfectly, the taste of your mother's bread, the sound of church bells on feast days, the feeling of being full after meals, but you sometimes can't remember what you ate yesterday or whether you fed the chickens this morning. Malnutrition apparently files memories differently. Joint pain has become your daily companion. Knees, hips, shoulders, everything aches with the kind of deep, persistent pain that suggests your body is consuming its own infrastructure. Moving hurts, but staying still hurts too, creating a constant low-level discomfort that colours every activity and makes rest impossible. The psychological effects might be worse than the physical ones. Concentration requires tremendous effort that you often can't spare. Planning beyond the next meal feels impossible because your brain refuses to engage with distant futures. Your emotional range has narrowed to immediate concerns, hunger, cold, safety, while complex feelings like ambition, romantic love, or intellectual curiosity have faded. But human adaptability is remarkable. You've learned to function with a reduced capacity, to accomplish necessary tasks while operating on minimal fuel. Your body has become efficient in ways you never knew were possible, finding energy reserves in places you didn't know existed. Survival, it turns out, is a skill that improves with practice. Your reflection in water looks like a stranger. Hollow cheeks, prominent bones, eyes that seem too large for your face. The person staring back appears older, more fragile, but also somehow stronger in ways that have nothing to do with physical strength. Surviving this long has required resources you didn't know you possessed. You're walking through the village when you witness something that would have been unthinkable just 2 years ago. A group of peasants openly ignoring the bailiff's orders about grain collection. Not violently, not dramatically, just not complying. They stand there arms crossed while he waves official documents and threats around like ineffective magic spells designed for a world that no longer exists. The thing is, what's he going to do? Arrest everyone. The jail can't hold half the village, and besides, the jailers are just as hungry as everyone else, and probably wouldn't mind joining the resistance if it meant getting access to communal food stores. Fine them? With what money? For what purpose? The traditional enforcement mechanisms of medieval justice assumed that people had something to lose beyond their lives. You watch the bailiff eventually give up and ride away on his increasingly thin horse, and nobody celebrates his departure. There's no victory here, just the quiet recognition that some forms of authority only work when everyone agrees to pretend they matter. And starvation has a way of clarifying exactly what matters most versus what's just social convention. Listen to the silence that follows confrontations like these. Not triumphant, just hollow, as if everyone realizes they've crossed a line they can't uncross, entered territory where old rules don't apply and new ones haven't been written yet. Tax collection has become a joke with a very unfunny punchline. The king's officials still arrive with their scrolls and demands, but they're greeted with empty granaries and genuinely empty purses. You can't collect grain taxes when there's no grain to tax, and you can't extract blood from turnips no matter how official your documents look. The feudal system, built on agricultural surplus and the assumption that peasants would always produce more than they consumed, starts to wobble when the agriculture disappears and consumption becomes more important than production. The entire social order was predicated on abundance that no longer exists. Court proceedings have gotten surreal. People are being charged with crimes like theft of food and illegal gleaning, but the punishments don't make sense anymore. Fining someone who stole bread because they were starving is like charging a drowning person for grabbing an unauthorized life preserver. Technically illegal, practically absurd. Some villages have started making their own rules, community agreements that supersede traditional authority. Informal councils decide how to distribute scarce resources, settle disputes, and maintain order without reference to lords, sheriffs, or royal decrees. It's not revolution exactly, it's more like practical democracy born from necessity and enforced through mutual survival interest. The church's authority has taken a similar hit. When Father Benedict preaches about accepting God's will while his own congregation slowly starves, the words ring hollow like bells with cracked bronze. People still attend services, but you can see them mentally checking out during sermons about patience and obedience to divine will that seems increasingly hostile. By the 4th year of famine, your village has essentially reorganized itself around resource sharing and collective survival, not through any formal declaration or revolutionary manifesto, but through a gradual series of practical decisions that have accumulated into something resembling socialism, medieval Storval style, implemented by people who've never heard the word but understand the concept perfectly. The old boundaries between your property and your neighbours have become flexible, more like suggestions than firm rules. When Thomas's roof collapsed from rain damage, people didn't wait for him to formally request help. They just showed up with tools and materials and fixed it, because a village member without shelter becomes everyone's problem during winter. You've joined what amounts to a foraging collective, groups of villagers who pool their knowledge about edible plants, share information about which areas haven't been completely stripped of resources, and distribute whatever they find according to need rather than who found it. Individualism has become a luxury that hungry communities can't afford to maintain. Listen to the sound of people working together, the rhythm of multiple tools, voices calling out discoveries, the collective sigh of shared exhaustion at the end of long days spent searching for anything edible in a landscape that's been picked nearly clean. Decision-making has become remarkably democratic out of sheer necessity. When everyone's survival depends on group choices about resource allocation, everyone gets a voice regardless of traditional social standing. The village council now includes people who would never have been consulted during normal times. Women, younger adults, even older children whose foraging skills have proven valuable. Skills have been redistributed based on utility rather than tradition or social expectation. The blacksmith has learned to identify edible roots because metalwork doesn't help when there's no food. The baker has become expert at stretching minimal ingredients into something resembling bread. The priest has started teaching basic food preservation techniques alongside the scripture. Tool sharing has evolved into a complex but efficient system that would impress a monastery quartermaster. Cooking pots, farming implements, even basic things like knives and spoons circulate through the community based on immediate need. Private property hasn't disappeared, but it's become much more communal in practice, more fluid and responsive to changing needs. But the most remarkable change is how conflict resolution has evolved. Disputes that might have escalated into violence or required official intervention now get mediated by community consensus. When survival depends on cooperation, people have learned to settle disagreements quickly and fairly because prolonged conflict threatens everyone's security. The traditional medieval concept of individual achievement has been replaced by collective success. Nobody hoards discoveries or keeps useful information secret because community survival has become more important than personal advantage. Innovation gets shared immediately because everyone benefits when someone figures out a new way to extract nutrition from unlikely sources. While your community has pulled together, others have chosen a different path. Travelling merchants have begun to specialise in famine profiteering, buying grain in less affected areas and selling it at astronomical prices to desperate communities. They arrive like well-fed vultures, calculating and opportunistic, turning human desperation into personal profit margins. You watch one such merchant negotiate with your village council, his round face shining with health while he haggles over the price of mouldy barley that wouldn't have been fit for animals during normal times. He wants silver, jewellery, family heirlooms, anything valuable that can be traded in distant markets where people still have surplus wealth to spend on luxuries. The worst part is that people pay his prices. When the choice is between financial ruin and watching your children die, financial ruin wins every time. Families trade away generations of accumulated wealth for weeks of survival, creating a massive transfer of resources from the desperate to the opportunistic, from those who need to those who already have. Listen to the sound of silver coins being counted by merchants who've never known hunger, each clink representing a family's decision to impoverish themselves rather than starve. The mathematics of desperation converted into the music of profit. Some of these merchants have formed networks, sharing information about which areas are most desperate and therefore most profitable. They move through the countryside like a specialised economy built on scarcity, creating artificial shortages in some places to drive up prices in others. It's capitalism in its purest and most brutal form, unmoderated by social conscience or community obligation. But not all merchants are predatory. A few have chosen to operate at cost, essentially becoming relief organisations rather than profit centres. These merchants often go unrecognised and unrewarded, quietly preventing starvation without making fortunes from misery. Their existence proves that profiteering is a choice, not an economic inevitability. The government has tried to regulate famine profiteering with limited success. Price controls are difficult to enforce when officials are dealing with their own food shortages and have more pressing concerns than market regulation. Besides, merchants can simply avoid regulated areas and sell their goods where controls don't exist. Religious institutions have struggled with their response to merchants who exploit hunger. Some church leaders condemn profiteering as sinful, while others argue that merchants who transport food from surplus areas to deficit areas are performing a valuable service regardless of their motives. The debate reveals deep theological questions about the morality of markets during crisis. You've learned to recognize the signs of communities that have been stripped by predatory merchants. Empty buildings where families sold everything and moved away, bitter resentment toward outsiders, and a particular kind of despair that comes from being exploited when you're already vulnerable. These places feel hollow in a way that goes beyond mere poverty. The most successful famine merchants understand psychology as well as economics. They arrive when people are desperate but not yet dead, offering just enough hope to extract maximum payment. They know exactly how much communities can afford to pay while still surviving, and they price their goods accordingly. Tonight, you count the few possessions your family still owns, knowing that each item might eventually be traded for survival. The merchant economy has taught everyone to view their belongings not as treasures or memories, but as potential calories, reducing human heritage to its exchange value in the desperate mathematics of staying alive. Winter arrives early in the 5th year, and by now you've learned to measure cold not just in temperature but in calories. Every shiver burns energy you can't afford to lose. Every breath of frigid air requires fuel your body doesn't have to spare. Your cottage, which used to feel cosy during winter evenings, now feels like a fragile shell barely holding back the hungry darkness outside. The firewood situation has become as critical as food. Trees are being cut down faster than they can grow back, stripped not just for heating but because bark and inner wood have become food sources. The forest that used to seem endless has started to look thin, skeletal, like the landscape itself is starving, along with its inhabitants, participating in the same desperate consumption. You've developed a complex internal accounting system for hope itself. Good days, when you find edible mushrooms or successfully trade for extra grain, you allow yourself to think about spring, about better harvests, about normal life returning. Someday, bad days, when another neighbour disappears or when your own hunger becomes overwhelming, you focus on just making it through the next few hours. Listen to the wind through the bare branches, sounding emptier now because the forest has fewer trees to catch it. Even the landscape's voice has become thinner, hungrier, more hollow, as if nature itself is learning to do more with less. Depression has settled over the community like another kind of weather, persistent and unavoidable as the rain that started this whole catastrophe. People move more slowly, speak less, smile rarely. It's not just individual sadness, but collective grief for a world that used to provide enough food, enough warmth, enough security to support normal human happiness. Children have stopped playing games that involve pretend abundance. No more playing feast or harvest celebration or wedding banquet. Their games now mirror adult concerns, rationing imaginary food, caring for sick dolls, building shelters against imaginary disasters. Childhood has adapted to accommodate trauma in ways that feel heartbreaking and impressive simultaneously. The village storyteller has changed his repertoire entirely. Gone are the tales of knights and dragons and magical abundance, replaced by stories about clever peasants who outwit hunger, about communities that survive through cooperation, about the virtue of small comforts during difficult times. Entertainment has become therapy disguised as distraction. Religious observance has shifted from celebration to endurance. Prayers focus less on gratitude and more on requests for strength to continue, for patience to endure, for forgiveness for the desperate choices people have made. Church attendance has actually increased, not from renewed faith, but from the basic human need for community during crisis. People come to sit together in shared misery rather than face despair alone. The church has become less a house of worship and more a communal space for processing collective trauma, a place where percents can be shared and burdens can be distributed among many shoulders instead of carried by individuals. You've learnt that survival sometimes requires decisions that normal morality would consider unthinkable. Not dramatic, terrible choices, though those happen too, but small daily calculations about who gets how much of what and who goes without. The mathematics of sacrifice have become as routine as checking the weather and just as necessary for planning each day. Every meal involves complex triage that would challenge a battlefield surgeon. The baby gets priority because infants die fastest from malnutrition and represent the future. Grandmother gets less because her metabolism is slower and she contributes less labour, though nobody says this directly. Father gets enough to maintain his strength for work that keeps everyone alive. You adjust your own portion based on everyone else's needs, turning self-care into a calculated decision rather than an automatic response. Margaret gets extra on days when she does more food preparation work. Children get priority when they're growing or when they're sick. The mathematics are precise and heartbreaking. Listen to the careful sonnets that surrounds these sacrifices. Nobody discusses them directly, because acknowledging the mathematics would make them unbearable, would turn survival strategies into moral judgments that the community can't afford to make. The village has developed informal protocols for community sacrifice that nobody talks about directly but everyone understands. Older people have started choosing to eat less, framing their sacrifice as lack of appetite or religious fasting. Younger adults work longer hours despite inadequate nutrition, burning themselves out to maximize community survival chances. Marriage and pregnancy have become subjects of careful calculation rather than emotional decisions. Young couples postpone weddings because they can't afford additional mouths to feed or the resources required for household establishment. Pregnant women face community pressure to be extra careful with their nutrition, but also subtle resentment because pregnancy requires resources that could otherwise support existing children. Tools and resources get allocated through complex community algorithms that balance individual need against collective survival. The family with the most children gets priority access to the cooking pot, but the family with the most able-bodied workers gets priority access to farming tools. Everything becomes mathematical, measured, weighed against everything else. Skill sharing has become mandatory rather than voluntary. If you know how to preserve food, prepare medications, or identify edible plants, that knowledge belongs to the community now. Hoarding information is considered as antisocial as hoarding grain, because collective ignorance threatens everyone's survival. But perhaps the most difficult sacrifice is the sacrifice of the future. Long-term planning becomes impossible when short-term survival is uncertain. Building projects stop mid-construction. Agricultural improvements that would pay off in future years get abandoned in favour of the immediate food production. The community is essentially eating its own future to survive the present. By the 6th year, time itself has started to feel different. Seasons blend together into a continuous struggle punctuated by small variations in desperation level. Spring doesn't bring hope anymore, just anxiety about whether this year's crops will finally succeed or fail again for reasons beyond anyone's control. Calendar time has been replaced by survival time. You mark days not by dates but by meals. How many days since you ate something that actually satisfied hunger? How long until the next expected food distribution? How much time before your current stores run out completely? The future has contracted to a horizon measured in weeks rather than years, in meals rather than seasons. Historical time has become irrelevant. People stop talking about before the famine and after the famine, because the famine has become permanent, the new normal that defines everything else. Memory of abundance feels like childhood fairy tales, real once perhaps, but no longer relevant to adult concerns or practical planning. Listen to church bells that ring less frequently now because the ringers are too weak or have moved away. Even the community's marking of hours has become irregular, unreliable, as if time itself is succumbing to the same forces that have disrupted everything else. Work rhythms have adapted to accommodate reduced energy and strength. Tasks that used to take a morning now require all day, with frequent rest breaks and careful pacing. Productivity has decreased, but expectations have adjusted accordingly. The community has learned to function at reduced capacity without guilt or frustration. Social rhythms have slowed to match physical limitations. Conversations move more slowly because thinking requires energy that people need to conserve for essential tasks. Decision-making takes longer because the stakes of every choice have become higher, because mistakes can't be easily corrected when resources are scarce. Sleep patterns have become irregular as hunger competes with exhaustion. People drift in and out of consciousness throughout the day, napping when energy permits, staying awake when hunger prevents rest. The normal cycle of work and sleep has been replaced by a more fluid rhythm of conservation and necessity. But strangest of all is how quickly this has become normal. 6 years of famine have created an entire generation of children who have never known food security, adults who can barely remember what abundance felt like, elders who wonder if normal times will ever return, or if this is simply how life works now. The temporary crisis has become a way of life, and the human capacity to adapt has created a new kind of society built around scarcity rather than plenty. People have learned to find meaning, even happiness, within constraints that would have seemed impossible to endure during the first year of crisis. You wake up in the autumn of 1322, and for the first time in 7 years, you can smell something that's been missing from the air: abundance. Not feast day abundance, but the basic agricultural prosperity that lets people worry about things other than immediate starvation. The fields around your village actually look like fields again instead of muddy disaster areas, green and gold and heavy with grain that will actually ripen properly. Your hands shake slightly as you help with the harvest, not from weakness this time, but from something approaching excitement mixed with disbelief. Every stalk of wheat you cut feels like a small miracle, and you catch yourself pausing occasionally to just look at the grain in your palm, solid and real and more precious than any jewelry you've ever imagined. The work feels different too. For 7 years, agricultural labour has been desperate, frantic attempts to salvage something from failing crops, to extract whatever nutrition possible from compromised plants. Now you're harvesting actual abundance, not luxury abundance, but enough abundance. Enough grain to eat through winter without counting every kernel. Listen to the sound of scythes moving through healthy grain, a rhythmic whisper that hasn't been heard at full volume for 7 years. The sound of productivity, of success, of a world that's remembered how to provide for its inhabitants instead of testing their endurance. But abundance after starvation creates its own strange problems. People who haven't eaten adequately in years suddenly have access to full meals, and bodies that have adapted to chronic hunger don't know how to process normal amounts of food. Several villagers make themselves sick gorging on fresh bread, their stomachs having forgotten how to handle anything beyond survival rations. The psychological adjustment is almost as difficult as the physical one. After years of careful rationing, hoarding, and constant anxiety about food security, people struggle to believe that the scarcity is actually ending. Families continue eating tiny portions and saving the rest, unable to trust that there will be more food tomorrow and the day after. Children who have grown up during the famine don't understand abundance. They hide food in their clothes, hoard scraps under their beds, and watch adults nervously when meals appear to be too generous. Teaching kids that they can actually fill their stomachs requires gentle persistence and multiple demonstrations that food security has returned. The market begins to look normal again, with vendors selling food at prices that don't require mortgage negotiations or family heirloom trades. But the psychology of famine pricing persists. Customers still gasp at costs that would have seemed reasonable before the crisis, having recalibrated their expectations during 7 years of desperation economics. Margaret cries the first time she's able to make bread using only flour, without bark or sawdust or other extenders. The loaf is small and simple, but it tastes like bread instead of survival, and the emotional impact is overwhelming. She sits in the kitchen holding the warm loaf and weeping for all the meals that weren't possible during the lean years. Recovery, you discover, is more than just having enough food again. It's trying to rebuild social structures, relationships and communities that were damaged by years of desperate choices. The village that emerges from the Great Famine isn't the same one that entered it. People have changed, priorities have shifted, and some things that were broken can't be fully repaired. Trust doesn't return overnight. Neighbours who hoarded food while others starved, families who abandoned community obligations for individual survival, people who profited from others' desperation. These relationships carry scars that abundance alone can't heal. Forgiveness becomes a community project that requires time, patience, and conscious effort from everyone involved. Property boundaries need to be renegotiated because survival necessities blurred the lines of ownership. Who officially owns the field that 3 families jointly worked for food? What about tools that were shared so extensively that individual ownership became meaningless? The legal system has to catch up with survival pragmatism that developed during the crisis. Listen to the tentative conversations as people begin to discuss long-term plans again, building projects, business ventures, marriages postponed by famine economics. The sound of hope returning, cautious but persistent, like birds testing their voices after a long winter. Marriages that were delayed by food scarcity begin to happen again, but with a new practicality that wouldn't have existed before the famine. Couples negotiate partnerships that explicitly include survival skills, resource management, and crisis preparation. Romance hasn't died, but it's learned to be more realistic about what marriage needs to accomplish. Craft specialization begins to return as people can afford to be something other than subsistence survival specialists. The blacksmith goes back to making tools rather than just repairing them endlessly. The baker starts experimenting with different types of bread beyond whatever can be scraped together. Economic diversity slowly replaces survival uniformity. But some changes are permanent improvements. The community cooperation networks that developed during the famine continue to function during recovery, creating a more resilient and equitable society. People have learned that collective action works better than individual competition when facing major challenges that threaten everyone. The church service includes new prayers of thanksgiving that acknowledge both divine providence and human cooperation. Religious faith has been deepened by crisis in some ways, made more practical and less abstract. Theology has learned to address real-world survival concerns rather than just spiritual abstractions that don't help during emergencies. Debt relationships become complex because so much will be pooled, traded, or shared during the emergency that traditional accounting doesn't work. The community essentially declares a collective amnesty for famine-related debts because trying to sort out who owes what to whom would create more problems than it solves. 2 years into recovery, you realize that surviving the Great Famine has taught lessons that abundance alone could never provide. You understand now which things are truly necessary and which are merely comfortable, which social bonds actually matter and which are just convenient, which skills are essential and which are ornamental luxuries. Food waste has become personally offensive in ways that people who never experienced real hunger couldn't understand. You find yourself saving scraps that would have been discarded before, not from poverty but from hard-earned knowledge about the value of calories. Waste represents not just inefficiency but disrespect for survival itself and for those who didn't make it through the crisis. Your relationship with weather has been permanently changed. Rain still makes you nervous, even when crops are healthy. Extended cold snaps trigger anxiety responses that are probably unreasonable but feel completely justified. You've learned that climate isn't just background for human activity, it's the foundation that everything else depends on. Community connections have been strengthened by shared crisis in ways that normal social interaction couldn't achieve. People who survived the famine together have bonds that go beyond friendship or neighbourliness. They've seen each other make difficult choices, share scarce resources, and choose cooperation over self-interest under extreme pressure. Listen to conversations that include the casual references to preservation techniques, resource management, and community cooperation that have become second nature, after years of necessity. The vocabulary of survival has enriched normal discussion, making it more practical and less abstract. Planning horizons have become more sophisticated. Before the famine, most people thought seasonally: plant in spring, harvest in autumn, survive winter. Now everyone thinks in terms of multi-year cycles, crop rotation, storage capacity, and backup plans for backup plans. Strategic thinking has become democratized through necessity. Skill diversity within the community has increased dramatically. Nearly everyone now knows basic food preservation, elementary medicine, multiple types of agriculture, and various craft techniques that used to be specialized knowledge. The population has become more resilient through forced cross-training that nobody wanted but everyone needed. But perhaps most importantly, you've learned to distinguish between individual survival and community survival. The famine taught that individual success is meaningless if the community collapses, but also that community survival requires individual contribution. The balance between self-interest and collective responsibility has been recalibrated through experience rather than theory. The Great Famine is ending, but its lessons will shape this community for generations. Children who grew up during the crisis will teach their own children about resource conservation, community cooperation, and the importance of agricultural surplus. The wisdom of scarcity will persist long after abundance returns. Storage techniques that were developed during the emergency become standard practice. People build larger root cellars, develop more sophisticated preservation methods, and maintain emergency supplies even during good years. The community has learned to prepare for cycles of abundance and scarcity, rather than assuming plenty will always continue. Social structures remain more flexible and egalitarian than they were before the crisis. The breakdown of traditional hierarchies during the emergency created space for more democratic decision-making, and people are reluctant to return to systems that proved inadequate during the crisis. Authority has to be earned rather than inherited. 5 years after the famine officially ended, you're watching a group of children play, and you realise they're different from children who grew up during normal times. These kids, now adolescents, have habits and perspectives shaped by scarcity that persist even though food is available. They automatically share whatever they have, they never waste anything, and they approach new situations with a cautiousness that seems beyond their years. Young William, who was 7 when the famine started, still hoards food under his bed despite his parents' gentle corrections. He can't quite believe that tomorrow's meals are guaranteed, that abundance might actually continue. When served generous portions, he eats slowly and saves half for later, unable to trust that more food will be available when he's hungry again. These children have developed skills that their parents never learned at their age. They can identify edible plants with the expertise of herbalists, preserve food using techniques that used to be professional knowledge, and calculate resource allocation with mathematical precision that would impress merchants. There are survivors in ways that peaceful times don't usually require. Listen to their games, which still involve careful resource management, collaborative problem solving, and scenarios where sharing determines survival. Even their play reflects lessons learned during years when mistakes meant hunger and cooperation meant life. But they're also surprisingly optimistic in some ways. Having lived through the worst crisis in living memory and emerged intact, they possess a confidence in their ability to handle whatever comes next. They've learned that humans can adapt to almost anything, that communities can survive devastating challenges, that recovery is possible even from seemingly hopeless situations. Their approach to conflict is different too. Having grown up in a community where disputes were settled quickly because prolonged disagreement threatened everyone's survival, they've internalized collaborative problem-solving techniques that older generations struggle to learn. They naturally seek solutions that benefit everyone, rather than pursuing individual advantage. Marriage patterns among famine survivors show interesting changes. Young people who live through the crisis together often marry earlier, and with more practical considerations than previous generations. They've already seen each other under extreme stress, already know who can be trusted when everything goes wrong, already understand that partnerships need to be based on more than attraction. The generation that grew up during the famine has developed what scholars might call crisis wisdom, an intuitive understanding of how to function during emergencies, how to maintain community bonds under pressure, how to find meaning and even happiness in circumstances that would seem devastating to people accustomed to plenty. These young adults approach planning differently than their elders. They automatically consider worst-case scenarios, build redundancy into their systems, and maintain relationships that can provide mutual support during difficult times. They are preparing for the next crisis even while enjoying the current recovery. The village that emerges from the Great Famine operates according to unwritten rules that would have been revolutionary before the crisis. Social hierarchies that seemed natural and permanent have been permanently altered by 7 years of survival challenges that rewarded competence over birthright, cooperation over dominance, and practical skills over traditional authority. Women's roles have expanded significantly. During the famine, gender became less important than ability when survival was at stake. Women who proved skilled at food preservation, resource management, or community organization now hold informal authority that persists during recovery. Margaret's expertise in stretching resources has made her a consulted advisor on community decisions. The church's relationship with the community has evolved from hierarchical to collaborative. Father Benedict still leads services, but community members now participate in theological discussions that would have been unthinkable before the crisis. Faith has become more practical, more focused on earthly survival needs, less concerned with abstract doctrinal issues. Economic relationships operate differently too. The extreme market conditions during the famine revealed the inadequacy of purely individual economic strategies, so the community has developed hybrid systems that combine individual enterprise with collective security. People still own property and operate businesses, but within frameworks designed to prevent anyone from falling into destitution. Listen to village council meetings where decisions get made through consensus-building processes that include voices that would never have been heard before the crisis. Democracy has emerged not from political theory, but from practical necessity experienced during years when bad decisions meant death. Trade relationships have become more reciprocal and less exploitative. The community's experience with predatory merchants during the famine has created strong social pressure against taking advantage of others' desperation. Business practices now include explicit consideration of community impact, not just individual profit. Conflict resolution emphasizes restoration over punishment. When disputes arise, the focus is on repairing relationships and addressing underlying problems, rather than assigning blame or administering penalties. The community learned during the crisis that they couldn't afford to lose productive members to feuds or punishment systems. Property rights have been modified to include community obligations. While people still own land, tools and houses, there's now an expectation that resources will be shared during emergencies. Private ownership exists within a framework of collective responsibility that wasn't formally negotiated but emerged from shared experience. The concept of legitimate authority has changed. Leadership roles now go to people who proved competent during the crisis, rather than those born into traditional positions of power. Authority has to be continuously earned through demonstrated ability to serve community needs, rather than individual interests. 10 years after the famine ended, the community lives with the knowledge that such disasters can happen again. This awareness has transformed from trauma into practical wisdom, creating systems and attitudes designed to prevent or mitigate future crises. The lessons learned aren't just memories, they're active preparations for challenges that may come. Food storage has become both individual and community responsibility. Every household maintains emergency supplies, but the village also supports collective granaries managed according to principles learned during the desperate years. Storage techniques developed during scarcity now serve abundance, creating security that didn't exist before the crisis. Agricultural practices have diversified to reduce vulnerability to weather-related crop failures. Instead of relying primarily on grain, farmers now plant varied crops with different growing requirements and harvest times. The community has learned that monoculture agriculture creates dangerous dependencies that can be catastrophic when conditions change. Knowledge preservation has become a priority. The skills and techniques developed during the famine are being documented and taught to ensure they're not lost as memory fades. Young people learn food preservation, wild plant identification, and resource management not because they need these skills immediately, but because they might need them someday. Listen to conversations about weather patterns, crop yields, and resource allocation that include sophisticated analysis that would have been beyond most people's capabilities before the crisis. The community has become more scientifically minded, more systematic in its approach to agriculture and resource management. Social networks have been strengthened and institutionalized. The mutual aid systems that emerged during the emergency now operate as permanent community features. People maintain relationships specifically designed to provide support during difficult times, creating resilience that goes beyond individual families. Economic planning includes explicit preparation for crisis conditions. Businesses maintain larger reserves, communities support economic diversity to reduce dependence on single industries, and trade relationships are structured to provide mutual support during regional difficulties. The economy has learned to be more resilient. Political structures now include mechanisms for emergency decision-making that can respond quickly to developing crises. The community has learned that normal governance processes can be too slow when rapid response is required, so they've created systems that can shift into crisis mode when necessary. The psychological resilience developed during the famine has become a community asset. People know they can survive extreme hardship, adapt to dramatic changes, and maintain social bonds under pressure. This confidence affects how they approach new challenges and changes, making the community more adaptable and less fearful of uncertainty. But perhaps most importantly, the community has learned to balance individual needs with collective survival in ways that don't require sacrificing either. The social systems that emerged from crisis have proven sustainable during recovery, creating a more equitable and resilient society that existed before the Great Famine tested everyone's assumptions about what human communities could endure and how they could adapt. Tonight, as you settle into sleep in a world where food security has returned, but the lessons of scarcity remain, you carry with you knowledge that goes far beyond survival techniques. You've learned that human communities are both more fragile and more resilient than anyone imagines during times of plenty. You understand now that abundance is precious precisely because it's temporary, that cooperation is valuable because isolation is deadly, and that hope persists because despair is unbearable. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed millions, transformed societies, and changed the trajectory of European history. But for those who survived, it also provided an education in resilience, community, and the fundamental relationships between human beings and the natural world that sustains them. It taught lessons about what matters and what doesn't, about which social structures serve human needs and which merely serve tradition. You survived not just through individual strength, but through community cooperation, not just through personal resources, but through shared wisdom, not just through luck, but through the hard-earned knowledge that humans can adapt to almost anything if they work together and refuse to give up hope even when hope seems impossible to maintain. The rain that started this 7-year nightmare eventually stopped. Crops grew again. Markets returned to normal. But the people who lived through the Great Famine were forever changed, carrying within them both the trauma of extreme hardship and the wisdom that comes from surviving the unsurvivable, from maintaining humanity during inhumane circumstances, from building community when community seemed impossible. Now sleep well and dream of harvests. Dream of full granaries and overflowing markets, of children who play without hunger and adults who plan without fear. Dream of communities that remember how to care for each other, that understand the difference between need and want, that know how precious and fragile and beautiful ordinary abundance really is. Sweet dreams, survivors, you've earned them. The church bells ring for evening vespers, but only half the usual congregation shuffles in, and those who do come wear expressions that suggest they're here more from habit than conviction. Father Benedict's voice has lost its confident resonance. Now it wavers like a candle flame in a drafty room, uncertain whether it will continue burning or simply give up and smoke out into nothing. You sit in your usual spot, the wooden pew worn smooth by generations of faithful believers, but tonight the familiar prayers feel like foreign words in your mouth. Give us this day our daily bread has become a cruel joke when there hasn't been daily bread for 4 years running. The irony tastes bitter, like the acorn flour that passes for communion. Days. Around you the congregation mumbles through responses they've known since childhood, but you can hear the doubt creeping into their voices. Where is the loving God who's supposed to provide for his children? Why would a benevolent creator allow babies to starve while their mother's milk dries up from malnutrition? These questions hang in the air like incense, except instead of sweet smoke, they smell like theological decomposition. Listen to the hollow echo of Amen, bouncing off stone walls that have heard too many unanswered prayers. The word used to sound like agreement, like faith confirmed. Now it sounds like resignation, like people going through motions they no longer believe in but don't know how to stop. Father Benedict tries to explain the famine as God testing faith, like Job in the scriptures, but even he doesn't seem convinced anymore. His sermons have shifted from promises of divine providence to vague platitudes about mysterious ways and eventual rewards in heaven. It's hard to care about treasures in heaven when your earthly stomach is consuming itself from the inside out. Some villagers have stopped coming to church entirely, not from defiance but from exhaustion, both physical and spiritual. What's the point of kneeling in prayer when standing up afterwards makes you dizzy from hunger? Why confess sins when the only sin anyone commits anymore is trying to survive another day? The whole structure of organised faith seems suddenly irrelevant, like rules for a game nobody's playing anymore. But others have gone the opposite direction, becoming more devout in their desperation. You see them prostrating themselves before the altar, fasting when they have nothing to fast from, flagellating themselves as if personal suffering might convince God to end collective suffering. Their faith has become frantic, militant, almost aggressive in its intensity. The church's decorations look obscene now, gold candlesticks and silver chalices gleaming while parishioners waste away. Several items have already been sold to buy grain for distribution, but plenty remains. Every reflection of light off precious metal feels like mockery, like the church hoarding beauty while its flock dies ugly deaths from starvation. Young Agnes used to sing in the choir with a voice that could make angels weep. Now she can barely whisper the hymns because malnutrition has stolen her breath along with her future. Watching her try to reach notes that used to come effortlessly is like watching faith itself struggle and fail over and over, Sunday after Sunday. As official religion fails to provide answers or relief, older beliefs start creeping back into daily life like weeds through cracked pavement. Practices that the church stamped out generations ago are being whispered about again, performed in secret by desperate people who'll try anything, to make the rain stop and the crops grow. Old Martha has started leaving bread offerings at the ancient oak tree outside the village, the one that predates Christianity in these parts. She claims the tree spirits might be more responsive than saints who seem to have gone deaf. Nobody reports her to Father Benedict anymore because honestly, who's to say she's wrong? The saints haven't been particularly helpful lately. You find yourself participating in these para-religious activities with a mixture of shame and hope, tying ribbons to branches while mumbling half-remembered incantations your grandmother might have known, leaving small offerings at crossroads, drawing protective symbols in the dirt around your cottage. It's probably nonsense, but nonsense that provides more comfort than official prayers that bounce off heaven's apparently closed doors. Listen to the whispered negotiations with forces that might or might not exist, promises made to spirits, to ancestors, to the land itself. Desperate people trying to strike bargains with anyone or anything that might have power to change circumstances that human effort can't affect. The village-wise woman, who spent decades being barely tolerated as a harmless eccentric, suddenly has a line of visitors seeking her herbal remedies and protective charms. Her combination of practical medicine and folk magic offers something the church can't: immediate action rather than patient suffering. Even if her potions are mostly hope mixed with bitter herbs, at least there's something to do besides wait for divine intervention. Dream interpretation has become serious business. People analyse their nighttime visions for signs, portents, warnings about weather, or hints about where to find food. The boundary between sleeping and waking wisdom has blurred because honestly, reality hasn't been particularly reliable lately. So why shouldn't dreams contain truth? Even the timing of daily activities has taken on mystical significance. Planting by moon phases, harvesting at specific hours, cooking while facing certain directions, these rituals provide structure and the illusion of control in a world that's proven human powerlessness repeatedly. If you can't control the weather, at least you can control when and how you respond to it. Animal behaviour gets scrutinised for meaning like ancient Romans reading entrails. When birds fly in certain patterns, when foxes are seen during daylight, when fish swim upstream, everything becomes potentially significant because random suffering is unbearable, but meaningful suffering can be endured. Humans need patterns, even imaginary ones. Some villages have revived seasonal festivals that the church had absorbed or suppressed. Bonfires at turning points of the year, ritual offerings to ensure good harvests, community ceremonies that bind people together through shared action rather than shared belief. These practices feel older, more fundamental than Christianity, reaching back to when humans first learned to farm and fear failed harvests. They started, appearing in the 4th year, wild-eyed men and women claiming direct revelation from God or the saints or sometimes stranger sources. They arrive in villages like yours, promising explanations, solutions, salvation from the endless hunger. And desperate people listen because what else is there to do but hope someone, somewhere, understands what's happening. The first one you encountered was Brother Francis, a former monk who claimed the famine was punishment for society's sins, particularly the wealth of the church and nobility. His solution involved collective repentance through extreme fasting, which would have been funny if people weren't desperate enough to try starving themselves harder to end the starvation. He gathered followers for about a month before moving on to spread his message elsewhere. Then came Marjorie the Mystic, who insisted she'd been shown visions of abundant harvests that would come if everyone just believed hard enough. She led prayer circles that went on for hours, participants swaying from exhaustion and hunger while chanting for divine intervention. When the promised abundance didn't materialize, she blamed insufficient faith and moved on to more receptive audiences. Listen to their certainty, their absolute conviction that they alone understand God's plan. It's almost envious how sure they are while everyone else drowns in doubt, how clearly they see purpose in suffering that feels meaningless to those experiencing it firsthand. The flagellant movements have grown stronger, groups of people wandering from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. They claim their suffering will appease God's wrath, that their blood will water the fields better than rain. It's disturbing to watch, but also strangely compelling because at least they are doing something, even if that something involves ritualized self-harm. Some prophets preach that the famine signals the end times, that Christ will return soon to judge the living and dead. They point to signs and portents, unusual weather patterns, social breakdown, the failure of traditional authority. Their followers give away what little they have left, preparing for an imminent apocalypse that would honestly be preferable to slow starvation. One travelling preacher claimed the famine was caused by Jews poisoning wells, by witches cursing fields, by heretics corrupting the faithful. His message of blame and hatred found eager audiences among people desperate to direct their anger, somewhere, anywhere, rather than accept that sometimes terrible things happen without reason or remedy. The violence that followed his visits took weeks to settle. But occasionally, a wandering prophet brings practical wisdom disguised as revelation. Sister Catherine travels with knowledge of food preservation techniques she claims were revealed in visions, but probably learned from years of managing convent stores. Her divine revelations about which plants are edible have saved numerous lives, even if her theology is questionable. The competition between prophets can be fierce. They argue theology in village squares, each claiming superior divine connection, each promising salvation through different means. Watching them debate while people starve around them would be entertaining if it weren't so desperately sad. Philosophy as performance art while the audience slowly dies. The famine has done something remarkable to the rigid gender roles that used to define village life. It's made them largely irrelevant. When survival depends on everyone contributing everything they can, traditional divisions of labour based on gender become luxuries nobody can afford. You've watched burly men learn to spin thread because cloth is needed, and women take up ploughing because fields need working regardless of who's holding the plough. Margaret has become one of the most important people in the village, not because she's your wife, but because her knowledge of food preservation, her skill at stretching resources, and her ability to make barely edible things palatable have kept dozens of families alive. The domestic skills that used to be dismissed as women's work have been revealed as fundamental survival expertise that everyone desperately needs to learn. The marketplace is filled with women traders, not by choice but by necessity. With many men weakened by malnutrition or dead from starvation-related diseases, women have taken over commercial activities that would have been scandalous before the famine. They negotiate prices with the sharp wisdom of experience, knowing exactly how much a family needs to survive because they've been managing that calculation for years. Listen to the changed rhythm of village work, women's voices calling out instructions in fields, men's voices discussing recipes and food storage, children learning all skills regardless of gender, because nobody knows what knowledge might prove vital for survival. The wise woman tradition has gained new respect as their herbal knowledge proves more immediately useful than many traditional male occupations. Women who know medicinal plants, who understand nutrition, who can manage resources efficiently have become informal leaders whose advice is sought on everything from agriculture to commerce to community organisation. Pregnancy and childbirth have become community concerns rather than private female matters. Everyone understands that pregnant women need extra nutrition that affects the entire community's resource allocation. Midwives have gained status as their skills directly impact community survival rates. The intimate knowledge of bodies and births has become publicly valuable rather than privately dismissed. Widows, who used to be among the most vulnerable members of society, have sometimes become the most powerful. Women who inherited their husband's property and proved capable of managing it have maintained independence that would have been impossible before the crisis. Some have become successful merchants, farmers, or craftspeople, proving that gender was never the limitation tradition claimed. Religious communities of women have shown remarkable resilience during the crisis. Convents that were self-sufficient before the famine have weathered the crisis better than many secular communities. Nuns' traditions of communal living, resource sharing, and practical skills have proven ideal for survival conditions. Some monasteries have actually asked convents for advice on resource management. Young girls are being raised differently now. Instead of learning only domestic skills in preparation for marriage, they're learning the same survival skills as boys: farming, hunting, construction, trade. Parents understand that their daughters need to be capable of complete self-sufficiency because marriage might not provide security and traditional gender roles might not ensure survival. Marriage, that fundamental social institution, has been transformed by the economics of scarcity. The traditional marriage market, where families negotiated unions based on property, bloodlines, and social advancement, has been replaced by desperate calculations about survival odds and resource management. Romance hasn't died, but it's learned to count calories and calculate labour value. Young Thomas wants to marry Ellen, but her family needs her labour and can't spare the resources for a dowry. His family needs additional workers but can't afford another mouth to feed. These negotiations would have been about land and livestock before the famine. Now they're about whether two people eating together consume less than two people eating separately, whether combined labour produces more than individual effort. The concept of dowries has almost completely collapsed because nobody has surplus wealth to transfer. Marriages are being arranged based on skills rather than property. A woman who knows food preservation might be more valuable than one with land inheritance. A man who can identify edible plants more desirable than one with noble blood but no practical abilities. Listen to the careful negotiations between families, not about pride or status, but about survival mathematics. Can this union produce enough additional resources to offset the cost of another person? Will combining households reduce overall resource consumption? These conversations are brutal in their practicality. Some couples are choosing not to marry at all, instead forming informal partnerships that avoid the legal and religious obligations of formal marriage. These arrangements allow for flexibility if circumstances change, if one partner becomes too ill to contribute, if better survival opportunities arise elsewhere. It's pragmatism dressed up as modern thinking. The Church's prohibition on divorce has created desperate situations where couples trapped in marriages can't reorganize their households for better survival. Odds. Some have found creative interpretations of annulment rules, claiming their unions were invalid for increasingly creative reasons. Father Benedict has learned to be flexible about canon law when rigid interpretation might mean starvation. Widows and widowers remarry with unseemly haste by traditional standards, but everyone understands that single-person households are inefficient during scarcity. These marriages of convenience often work better than expected because both parties understand the arrangement's practical nature and appreciate the mutual support without expecting romantic love. The age of marriage has shifted in both directions. Very young marriages happen when families need to consolidate resources immediately. Very late marriages occur when older people finally have enough security to risk taking on a partner. The traditional marriage age has become meaningless when survival doesn't follow traditional timelines. Fertility has become a complex issue. Children represent future labour and community survival, but also immediate resource consumption that might not be sustainable. Some couples actively avoid pregnancy through various means the Church pretends not to notice. Others desperately try to conceive, seeing children as hope for recovery that their generation might not live to see. The famine has stolen childhood from an entire generation, replacing play with work, innocence with harsh pragmatism, and careless joy with careful calculation. You watch your youngest, barely 7, managing resource calculations that would challenge adults, and you mourn for the childhood she'll never have while admiring the competence she's developed instead. Children have become economic actors in ways that would have horrified previous generations. 6-year-olds forage for edible plants with the focus of professional herbalists. 8-year-olds negotiate trades with the shrewdness of merchants. 10-year-olds manage household resources with more skill than many adults possessed before the crisis. Necessity has created competence that comes too early, but might ensure survival. The games children play have evolved to reflect their reality. Instead of knights and dragons, they play finding food and trading at market and surviving winter. Their dolls don't have tea parties. They have rationing meetings. Their toy soldiers don't fight wars. They organize resource distribution. It's heartbreaking and impressive simultaneously. Listen to their conversations, not about toys or treats, but about calories and preservation techniques, about which plants are poisonous and which are merely unpleasant, about how many days a handful of grain can be stretched. They sound like tiny adults because circumstances have required them to become exactly that. Education has transformed from luxury to survival necessity, but the curriculum has changed dramatically. Instead of Latin and rhetoric, children learn plant identification and food preservation. Instead of theology and philosophy, they study weather patterns and agricultural techniques. Practical knowledge has replaced classical learning because Cicero doesn't fill stomachs. The traditional apprenticeship system has collapsed because masters can't afford to feed apprentices and families can't spare children's labour. Kids learn trades informally, picking up skills wherever they can, creating a generation of jack-of-all-trades survivors rather than specialised craftspeople. They might not master any single skill, but they become competent at everything. Child mortality has created a horrible pragmatism in parenting. Parents love their children, but have learned not to become too attached too early, not to invest too many resources in children who might not survive. It's not cruelty. It's protection against unbearable grief multiplied by frequency. Love has learned to hold something in reserve. Children have developed their own informal support networks independent of adult supervision. Groups of kids share food, information, and protection in ways that mirror adult survival communities but with their own rules and hierarchies. They've created their own economy of childhood bartering, a whistle for an apple core, a pretty stone for information about where berries grow. But these children have also developed remarkable resilience and wisdom. They understand community, cooperation, and resource management in ways that privilege and abundance could never teach. They might have missed traditional childhood, but they've gained survival skills and social consciousness that will serve them and their communities for life. The village healer's cottage used to smell of herbs and hope, dried bundles of medicinal plants hanging from rafters, mysterious tinctures bubbling over careful fires, the earthy scent of roots and remedies. Now it smells of helplessness and futility, because what good are medicines when the fundamental problem is absence of food? You can't cure starvation with willow bark tea. Master Hugh, who learned his healing arts from his father and grandfather before him, sits surrounded by his carefully labelled jars and bottles, looking lost. A lifetime of medical knowledge has been rendered largely irrelevant by the simple fact that most current ailments stem from malnutrition, and the only cure for malnutrition is nutrition that doesn't exist. He might as well try to cure drowning without providing air. The traditional remedies all assumed a basically healthy population dealing with occasional illness. Fever, sweat it out with hot herbal drinks. Wounds, keep them clean and let the body heal itself. Digestive problems, adjust the diet. But what do you do when the entire population is fundamentally unwell, when bodies lack the basic resources needed for healing? When diet adjustment means choosing between different forms of inadequate nutrition? Listen to the quiet desperation in healers' voices as they explain why treatments aren't working, why wounds won't heal, why simple illnesses that should resolve in days are lingering for weeks or becoming fatal. They sound like mechanics trying to repair engines without replacement parts, technically knowledgeable but practically powerless. The hierarchy of medical knowledge has shifted. University-trained physicians who understood theoretical medicine but relied on well-fed patients have become less useful than folk healers who know which weeds provide which nutrients. Formal medical training assumed resources that no longer exist, while traditional knowledge about survival foods has become the most valuable medicine available. Diseases that were manageable before have become death sentences. A simple cold can kill someone whose body has no reserves to fight infection. Minor injuries become major problems when bodies can't spare resources for healing. Pregnancy, always risky, has become terrifyingly dangerous when mothers' bodies can barely sustain themselves, much less grow new life. The concept of medical triage has evolved from battlefield necessity to daily reality. Healers have to choose who gets their limited medicines based on who's most likely to survive and contribute to community survival. It's brutal mathematics that nobody trained for, deciding whether to use precious herbs on a child who might die anyway, or an adult who can work if they recover. Traditional medical ethics have collapsed under the weight of scarcity. The healer's oath to do no harm becomes complicated when treating one person means another goes without. The obligation to preserve life becomes impossible when preservation requires resources that don't exist. Medical practice has become a series of impossible choices between different forms of harm. Mental distress, what might be called depression, or anxiety in modern terms, has become epidemic, but there's no treatment beyond survival itself. Healers recognize the symptoms: lethargy, hopelessness, disconnection from community, But what remedy exists for rational responses to catastrophic circumstances? You can't medicine away justified despair. Diseases become strangely egalitarian during the famine. The physical differences between nobles and peasants have largely disappeared as everyone's immune system weakens from malnutrition. Lord Robert's son died from the same wasting sickness that killed the beggar's child. Plague doesn't check your social status before infecting you, and hunger has made everyone equally vulnerable. The traditional defences the wealthy used against disease, better food, cleaner living conditions, access to physicians, have all collapsed. When there's no good food, when everyone lives in damp conditions because fuel for heating is scarce, when physicians are as helpless as everyone else, wealth provides no protection against the democracy of epidemic disease. You notice that illness spreads differently now. Instead of hitting the poor quarters first and hardest, disease moves through the entire community simultaneously. The manor house has the same coughing sickness as the peasant cottages. The merchant families suffer the same digestive disasters as the day labourers. Malnutrition has levelled the playing field in the worst possible way. Listen to the coughing that echoes through the village at night, from grand houses and humble cottages alike. A symphony of respiratory distress that recognises no social boundaries, conducted by hunger and accompanied by the percussion of fevered shivering. The social response to disease has changed too. Before the famine, the wealthy could isolate themselves from contagion. But now everyone needs everyone else to survive, so isolation isn't possible. The Lord needs peasants to work whatever fields might produce food. Peasants need the Lord's resources and organisation. Disease has to be endured collectively, because isolation means death from starvation, if not from illness. Traditional quarantine practices have become impossible to maintain. How do you isolate sick family members when every hand is needed for survival tasks? How do you avoid contagion when community cooperation is essential? The choice between risking disease and ensuring starvation isn't really a choice at all. The stigma attached to certain diseases has diminished because everyone understands that illness is now primarily about bad luck rather than bad behaviour. The skin conditions that come from malnutrition, the digestive problems from eating inappropriate foods, the respiratory infections from weakened immunity, these aren't moral failings but survival side effects. Community care for the sick has evolved from charity to mutual insurance. Everyone knows they might be next to fall ill, so caring for sick neighbours becomes investment in future reciprocity. The traditional Christian obligation to tend the sick has been reinforced by practical understanding that community to survival requires maximum participation. Some diseases have actually disappeared during the famine, not from medical triumph but from changed conditions. Diseases of excess like gout have vanished along with excess itself. Certain parasites that required well-fed hosts have died out. It's a grotesque form of medical progress, achieving health through universal deprivation. The famine has created a demographic catastrophe that extends beyond immediate deaths to include the children who will never exist because their potential parents died or became infertile from malnutrition. You realise with creeping horror that entire family lines are ending, that genealogies stretching back centuries are terminating in the present moment of mass starvation. Women throughout the village have stopped menstruating, their bodies making the biological calculation that reproduction is currently impossible. It's protective in a way. Pregnancy during famine often kills both mother and child. But it also represents a lost generation, a demographic gap that will echo through decades of future history. Young couples who should be starting families are either dead, too malnourished to conceive, or making conscious decisions to avoid pregnancy until conditions improve. The traditional pressure to produce heirs has been replaced by the practical necessity of not creating additional mouths that can't be fed. Family planning has become community survival strategy. Listen to the strange quiet in the village, not just from reduced population, but from the absence of baby cries, toddler laughter, and children playing. The soundtrack of human continuity has been temporarily suspended, replaced by the hollow sounds of a community without a clear future. Midwives have largely shifted from delivering babies to preventing pregnancies, sharing knowledge that the church would condemn during normal times, but currently pretends not to notice. They distribute herbal contraceptives, teach rhythm methods, and provide counsel about avoiding conception. It's technically heretical, but practically necessary, Puri. The few pregnancies that do occur often end badly. Miscarriages are so common they're barely mentioned anymore. Stillbirths have become expected rather than exceptional. The rare successful births produce infants so fragile that their survival odds are heartbreakingly low. Each baby becomes a community project, everyone contributing what they can to improve its chances. The psychological impact on women who've lost multiple pregnancies or babies is devastating, but largely unacknowledged. There's no time or energy for proper grieving when survival requires constant effort. These losses get internalized, creating deep wounds that will never properly heal, trauma that will echo through lifetimes even after the famine ends. Traditional inheritance patterns have become meaningless when there might be no one to inherit. Families that spent generations accumulating property now face extinction not through war or disease, but through the simple absence of next generations. The careful planning of ancestry has been replaced by the chaos of demographic collapse. But perhaps most disturbing is how quickly this has become normalized. Young people talk casually about not having children until after the famine, as if this is a temporary inconvenience rather than a fundamental breaking of human continuity. The biological imperative to reproduce has been overridden by the more immediate imperative to survive. Property lines that seemed eternal have become fluid suggestions rather than fixed boundaries. You remember when everyone knew exactly where their land ended and their neighbours began, when boundary stones were sacred markers defended with violence if necessary. Now those same stones sit ignored while people forage wherever they can find food, and nobody objects because everyone understands that survival supersedes property rights. The common lands that used to be carefully regulated, specific days for grazing, particular families allowed to gather wood, strict rules about gleaning, have become free-for-alls of necessity. The tragedy of the commons has been replaced by the tragedy of scarcity, where there's not enough to overexploit even if everyone wanted to. You can't overgraze when there are no animals left to graze. Private gardens have evolved into semi-public spaces through necessity rather than generosity. When Margaret's turnips mature, neighbours help harvest them in exchange for shares. When Thomas's fruit tree produces its meagre yield, the distribution gets negotiated by committee. Individual ownership has been replaced by complex webs of obligation and reciprocity that nobody formally agreed to but everyone participates in. Listen to the absence of dogs barking at property boundaries. The guard dogs have been eaten, and the properties they guarded have become communal by default. The silence represents not just missing animals, but missing concepts of exclusive ownership that seemed natural just years ago. Forest boundaries have become completely meaningless as people range farther and farther in search of food. The king's forest, traditionally off limits on pain of death, gets stripped of bark, mushrooms, and small game by people who've decided that execution for poaching is preferable to certain starvation. Royal authority means nothing to empty stomachs. Buildings themselves have become communal resources. Empty houses left by families who died or fled get repurposed as communal storage, shared workshops, or emergency shelters. Nobody formally decides this, it just happens through practical necessity. Space is too valuable to leave unused just because its original owners no longer need it. Field systems have been completely reorganized based on what actually grows rather than traditional ownership. Strips that used to belong to different families have been consolidated into communal plots worked collectively. The three-field system has been abandoned in favor of planting anything anywhere that might possibly produce food. Agricultural tradition has given way to desperate experimentation. Even domestic spaces have been transformed. Individual family cottages now often house multiple families sharing resources and warmth. Privacy has become an unaffordable luxury when sharing space means sharing heat, food preparation, and security. The nuclear family household has been replaced by survival clusters that form and reform based on changing circumstances. Churches have transformed from purely religious spaces into everything from hospitals to food distribution centres to communal kitchens. Sacred space has become practical space because God, presumably, would prefer his house be used to save lives rather than maintained as pristine worship venues while people die outside. The landscape itself has been transformed by 7 years of desperation. You stand on Kaur, the hill overlooking your village, and barely recognise it anymore. Where forests once stood thick and dark, now there are meadows of stumps. Where organised fields once showed human mastery over nature, now there's a patchwork of abandoned plots and desperate attempts at cultivation that follow no traditional pattern. Entire villages have been abandoned, their inhabitants either dead or relocated to places rumoured to have better survival odds. You've walked through these ghost settlements, houses standing empty with doors hanging open, gardens returning to wilderness, churches that echo only with wind. These places feel haunted not by spirits but by absence itself, the absence of human activity that once defined them. Roads have deteriorated from lack of maintenance and reduced traffic. Why maintain roads when there's nothing to transport and nowhere to go? Bridges have collapsed and not been rebuilt. Paths between villages have become overgrown as fewer people travel and trade. The infrastructure of civilization has been abandoned to focus on the immediate necessity of not dying. Listen to the strange tuttants of formerly busy places, market squares where merchants once shouted their wares, mills that no longer turn because there's no grain to grind, workshops that stand empty because nobody can afford craft goods when all resources go toward food. Water sources have been fundamentally altered. Mills have been destroyed to return streams to their natural courses in hopes of improving fishing. Wells have been dug in desperate attempts to find clean water as traditional sources become contaminated. Entire communities have relocated to be closer to reliable water, abandoning centuries of settlement patterns. The boundaries between cultivated and wild land have blurred beyond recognition. Fields lie fallow not by choice but from inability to work them. Gardens have gone to seed, orchards stand untended. Meanwhile, wildlands have been so thoroughly foraged that they're less productive than before human desperation stripped them of everything edible. Landmarks that once organised social geography have lost their meaning. The market cross where people gathered to trade stands in an empty square. The milestone that marked distances to important towns points toward places that might no longer exist. The boundary oak that separated parishes has been cut down for firewood, erasing centuries of geographical meaning in one desperate winter. Sacred geography has been reconfigured by necessity. Pilgrimage routes have been abandoned because travel is too dangerous and there's nothing to eat along the way. Holy wells have run dry or been contaminated. Shrine offerings have been stolen for their material value. The spiritual landscape that once provided meaning and structure has been stripped down to bare survival. But new geographies have emerged from the crisis. Networks of mutual aid that follow no traditional boundaries. Trading routes based on who has surplus and who has desperate need. Information networks that spread knowledge about food sources and survival techniques. A human geography of crisis that will persist long after the traditional landscape reasserts itself.